The fire came first, then the horns. I stood at the tall arched window of my bedroom on the second floor, one hand still holding the crystal glass of deep red wine I had been sipping while reviewing the month's ledgers. 38 years old, owner of the three largest iron foundries in the most profitable warehouse district in the wealthy quarter of Ashevale, I had built a life of quiet luxury. The stone mansion I lived in was the third grandest in the entire town. Tall windows, thick velvet drapes, polished oak floors that gleamed even in firelight. Yet tonight, the valley below my estate was burning. Orange light danced across the ceiling like a living thing. The granaries along the river had gone up first, then the merchant houses, then the stables. The smell of smoke had already crept through the cracks around the window frames, sharp and bitter. I set the glass down on the marble side table, crossed to the wall, and took down the long sword I kept more for show than for use. My heart beat hard, but it was not fear that quickened it. It was something sharper. Curiosity. The war horns of the orcs sounded again, low, heavy, like stones dragged across the bottom of a well. They were not the horns of a raiding party. These were the horns of General Morvag Drath, and everyone in Ashevale knew what that meant. I had just reached the top of the grand staircase when the front doors of my mansion exploded inward. Boots, many of them, thundered across the marble foyer. Shouts in the rough orc tongue echoed up the stairwell. I backed into the shadows of the upper landing, sword half raised, listening. They were not looting. They were searching. I caught fragments of their words, the tube, the daughter Drath's blood. Then they began kicking open doors on the ground floor. I retreated silently down the long corridor to my bedroom and closed the heavy oak door behind me. My servants had fled at the first sound of the horns. The house was empty except for me. I moved to the tall four-poster bed, the one carved from dark walnut and draped in silk that had cost more than most men earned in a lifetime. The firelight from outside painted everything in shifting gold and red. A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun sword coming up. 2 orc warriors had already entered through the side balcony door I had left unlatched for the night breeze. Black leather armor, iron studs, axes in their hands. One of them dropped to his knees and looked straight under my bed. "She's here," he growled in thick common. I can smell her fear. Before I could move, something shifted in the darkness beneath the heavy bed frame. A pale green hand shot out, seized the kneeling warrior's ankle, and yanked with terrifying strength. He crashed forward face, slamming into the floorboards. In the same fluid motion, a woman rolled out from under the bed like liquid shadow. She was young, no more than 25, skin a deep, rich olive green that caught the firelight like polished bronze. Long black hair, tangled and streaked with ash, fell across her face. 2 small, elegant tusks framed her full lower lip. Her traveling leathers were torn at the shoulder and side, dark blood already soaking through the cloth. In one hand, she clutched a small leather tube wrapped in oilskin, pressing it to her chest as though it were the only thing keeping her heart beating. Our eyes met for one frozen heartbeat. Golden eyes, bright, exhausted, and utterly unafraid. Then she moved. The second warrior swung his axe. She ducked under it with impossible grace, drove a short blade up under his jaw, and twisted. He died without a sound. The first warrior was already rising, roaring. She kicked his knee sideways, slammed her elbow into his throat, and finished him with the same blade before he could draw breath. 3 heartbeats. 2 dead orcs on my bedroom floor. She stood there, breathing hard blood on her hands, the leather tube still clutched tight. Rain and smoke clung to her. The fire outside painted her green skin in shifting bronze and gold. She looked at me. "If you raise your voice," she whispered, voice hoarse and low, "they will kill you too. My father does not leave witnesses." I should have shouted. I should have run. Instead, I found myself staring at the way her chest rose and fell, at the small cut across her temple, at the way her fingers trembled around that tube. She was the most beautiful and dangerous thing I had ever seen walk out of hell. And she had just killed 2 of her own people under my bed. I lowered my sword a fraction. "Who are you?" I asked, keeping my voice as quiet as hers. "Kyra Drath," she answered. The name landed like cold iron in my chest. Daughter of General Morvag Drath, the same general whose army was burning my town to the ground. "I stole this from your warehouse tonight. I needed a place to hide. I didn't know this house belonged to—" She didn't finish. More boots were already climbing the main staircase. Kyra swayed on her feet. Blood kept dripping from her shoulder onto my expensive rug. She looked at the wardrobe in the corner, then back at me. I made the decision before I could think it through. I crossed the room in 3 strides, opened the tall wardrobe, and pushed her inside. She didn't resist. I left the door open just a crack, then turned to face the bedroom door as it burst open. 2 more orc warriors stormed in. They saw the bodies on the floor. I raised my sword, trying to look like a man who had just fought for his life. "They came in," I said, voice steady. "I killed them. They were looking for something." One of the newcomers narrowed his eyes. He stepped closer to the wardrobe. I could smell the smoke and wet leather on him. For one terrible second, I thought he would open it. The other barked an order in their tongue. The first orc hesitated, then turned away. They searched the room quickly under the bed again, behind the curtains inside the tall chest of drawers, but they never opened the wardrobe. Perhaps they believed no one would be foolish enough to hide there after killing two of their own. When they finally left, slamming the door behind them, the room fell silent, except for the distant roar of fire and the hammering of my own heart. I waited until the boots faded down the corridor, then opened the wardrobe door. Kyra stepped out. Her face was pale under the green. She looked at me for a long moment, golden eyes searching mine like she was trying to decide whether I was going to hand her over after all. "You didn't shout," she said softly. "No," I answered. "I didn't." She swayed again. I caught her before she could fall, one arm around her waist. She was lighter than she looked, but warm, almost fever-hot from running and fighting. The smell of her was smoke and rain and something faintly sweet like crushed pine needles after a storm. I lowered her gently onto the edge of my bed. She didn't protest. She simply sat there, elbows on her knees, head bowed, the leather tube still clutched in both hands like a lifeline. Outside, my town kept burning. Inside my bedroom, the only sound was her breathing and the soft crackle of the fire I had left burning low in the hearth. I stood there watching her, the sword still loose in my hand, and realized with perfect clarity that the night my town caught fire had just become the most alive I had felt in 10 years. And it had started the moment I pulled the Orc General's daughter out from under my bed. The fire died sometime before dawn, but the smoke stayed. I stood on the wide stone balcony of my mansion as the first gray light touched the valley. Ashvale looked like a wound. Half the town was blackened rubble. The wealthy quarter had fared better. My house still stood along with the homes of the other rich merchants, but the warehouses along the river were gone. Two of my own foundries were nothing but twisted iron and glowing embers. The air tasted of wet charcoal and loss. I had not slept. Kyra had left before the sun rose. She slipped out the same balcony door she had used to enter, moving like smoke herself. The only proof she had ever been here was the small leather tube I now kept locked inside the hidden drawer of my desk and the dark bloodstains on my bedroom rug that the servants had not yet noticed. I told the returning staff that orc raiders had broken in and I had killed two of them. They believed me. Why wouldn't they? I was Elias Voss, wealthy, respected, and known for keeping my affairs private. No one asked why the bodies had been dragged out and burned before anyone else could see them. No one asked about the third set of footprints in the ash outside my window. But I could not stop thinking about her. All morning I walked the ruined streets with Marcus Hale, my closest business partner and the second richest man in Ashvale. He was a tall, sharp-eyed man with graying hair and a mind like a ledger. He kept glancing at the smoke still rising from the lower town. "Drath's army," he muttered. "They weren't here for plunder. They were looking for something specific. You heard the horns, same as the ones from the northern mines last year." I said nothing. My hand brushed the pocket where I had hidden a scrap of green cloth I had found caught on the balcony railing after Kyra left. It smelled faintly of pine and smoke. By midday, the rumors had already started. Cedric Vale's soldiers had arrived to restore order. They were already asking questions about anyone who had seen the Orc General's daughter. A reward had been posted, 50 gold crowns for information leading to her capture. I rode to the Border Academy that afternoon under the excuse of finalizing a new trade contract that required precise translation of Orc commercial terms. The academy sat on a low hill at the eastern edge of town, its stone buildings untouched by the fire. Students in dark robes moved between lectures, their voices bright despite the smoke still hanging over the valley. I found her in the main library. Kyra stood at the head of a long oak table surrounded by 20 young students. She wore a simple gray scholar's robe, the hood pushed back. Her black hair was neatly braided and pinned the cut on her temple hidden beneath a small bandage. No one would have guessed that only hours earlier she had killed 2 warriors under my bed. Her voice was low, calm, and surprisingly gentle as she explained an ancient border treaty written in Old Orcish. The students leaned forward, hanging on every word. One young woman raised her hand and asked a complicated question about dialect shifts. Kyra smiled, small, patient, almost warm, and answered without hesitation. I stood in the doorway and watched her for a long time. This was the same woman who had hidden under my bed like a hunted animal. Now she was the most beloved lecturer in the academy's history, according to the whispers I had heard while walking the halls. Everyone called her Professor Drath, though they never used her full name in public. They said she was strict but fair, brilliant, and strangely kind to the shy students. She looked up and saw me. For the briefest moment, her golden eyes widened. Then the mask slipped back into place. She finished her explanation, dismissed the class with a quiet word, and walked toward me as though we were strangers. "Master Voss," she said politely, inclining her head, "I was told you wished to discuss a contract involving northern trade routes." Her voice gave nothing away. I played along. Yes, the wording in the old orc clauses is delicate. I thought perhaps an expert could help me avoid costly misunderstandings. She studied me for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Of course. Would tomorrow afternoon suit you? My last lecture ends at 4. Actually, I said, surprising myself, I was hoping we could begin this evening. My library at home has the original documents. It would be quieter there. A flicker of something caution curiosity perhaps both crossed her face. She glanced once at the students still gathering their scrolls, then back at me. Very well, she said. I will come at 7. Alone. She arrived exactly on time. I had dismissed the servants for the evening. The house was quiet except for the soft crackle of the fire I had lit in the main study. When I opened the door, Kyra stood on the step wearing a plain dark cloak, the hood drawn low. No blood, no torn leather, just a scholar visiting a merchant. I led her upstairs to the study, the same room where she had hidden the night before. The bloodstains had been scrubbed away, but I could still see the faint shadow of them if I looked closely. We sat across from each other at the heavy oak table. Between us lay several old contracts and the leather tube I had taken from her. I had not opened it. Not yet. She noticed it immediately. Her shoulders tensed, but she said nothing. For the first hour, we spoke only of trade terms, grammar, and the precise meaning of certain orc legal phrases. Her voice remained calm and professional. She corrected my translations with gentle precision, occasionally reaching across the table to point at a line of text. Her fingers were long and strong, the nails short and clean. A faint scar ran across the back of her left hand. Every time she leaned forward, I caught the same faint scent of pine and smoke. Eventually, the conversation drifted. You could have turned me in last night, she said quietly, eyes still on the document in front of her. 50 gold crowns is a great deal of money, even for a man like you. I agreed. She looked up. Golden eyes met mine directly for the first time since she had entered the house. Why didn't you? I leaned back in my chair and studied her. The firelight painted warm highlights across her green skin and made the small tusks at the corners of her mouth gleam. Because the moment I pulled you out from under my bed, I said slowly, something changed. I have spent the last 10 years building an empire of iron and coin. Everything was orderly, predictable. Then an orc general's daughter crawled out of the shadows beneath my bed and killed 2 warriors in the time it takes most men to draw breath. And instead of fear, I felt alive. She was silent for a long time. You are a strange man, Elias Voss. I have been called worse. A small tired smile touched her lips, the first I had seen since the night before. It transformed her face. For a moment she was not the fugitive or the scholar. She was simply a young woman sitting across from me in the firelight. She told me pieces of her story that night. Not everything, just fragments. How her father had planned to marry her off to a brutal warlord to strengthen his position. How she had refused. How she had stolen the tube proof of secret dealings between her father and Cedric Vale that would have sold out half the border towns for profit. How she had run and how my warehouse had been the closest safe place she could reach before the army closed in. I listened without interrupting. When she finally fell silent, the fire had burned low. You still have the tube, she said, glancing at the drawer where I had placed it. Yes. Are you going to keep it? I haven't decided yet. She stood. The movement was graceful, but I could see the stiffness in her injured shoulder. I should go. The academy has early lectures tomorrow. I walked her to the side door that opened onto the garden. Before she stepped into the night, she paused, one hand on the frame. Thank you, she said softly, for not shouting, for the fire, for listening. I nodded once. She disappeared into the darkness between the hedges. I stood there for a long time after she was gone, listening to the quiet creak of the house settling around me. The scent of pine and smoke still lingered in the study. Later, when I went upstairs to lock the documents away, I noticed something small on the windowsill of my bedroom, the same window she had used to escape the night before. A single black hair caught on the edge of the latch. She had been back, not to steal, not to threaten. She had simply returned to the place where everything had changed the same way I could not stop returning to the memory of her golden eyes in the firelight. I closed the window gently and smiled into the dark. The night my town burned had not ended when the fires died. It had only just begun. The days after the fire settled into a strange, watchful rhythm. Ashvale was rebuilding, but the scars remained. Charred beams still stood like blackened ribs along the river. Cedric Vale's soldiers patrolled the streets in pairs, eyes sharp for any sign of the orc general's daughter. The reward posters bearing Kyra's name had been pasted on every tavern wall and market stall. 50 gold crowns, dead or alive. I went about my business as though nothing had changed. By day, I met with merchants, inspected the damaged foundries, and signed new contracts that would keep my warehouses full once the roads were cleared. Marcus Hale watched me more closely than usual. He would appear at my door unannounced, asking careful questions about the night of the raid, about whether I had seen anything unusual. I told him the same story I told everyone else. 2 orc raiders had broken in, I had killed them, and that was all. He never quite believed me. At night, the house felt different, larger, emptier. I left the side garden door unlatched and the study window cracked open. On the heavy oak table, I placed a single ledger carefully prepared, filled with false entries about secret shipments of iron and silver moving north through the passes. Routes that would interest both General Morvag and Cedric Vale. Bait. I waited. The first time she came, I never showed myself. I sat in the deep leather chair in the far corner of the study, the room lit only by the low fire. The clock on the mantel had just struck 2 when I heard the soft scrape of boots on the stone balcony. A shadow slipped through the window. Kyra moved like memory, silent, precise. She crossed to the table, flipped open the ledger, and began reading by the faint firelight. Her green fingers traced the lines with practiced speed. I watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way the fire painted gold across the curve of her cheek and the small tusks at the corners of her mouth. She stayed nearly an hour. She copied several pages into a small notebook she carried, then closed the ledger exactly as she had found it. Before she left, she paused at the window and looked once around the room as though she could feel eyes on her. She never saw me. The second time was 3 nights later. I had left the ledger in the same place, but this time I sat in plain view at the head of the table, a single lamp burning low. When she slipped through the window, she froze the instant she saw me. Her hand went to the knife at her belt. I did not move. "I knew you would come back," I said quietly. She stared at me for a long moment. The firelight caught the faint scar on her temple and the tension in her shoulders. "You left this for me," she said. It was not a question. Yes. Why? Because I want to know what is inside that tube you risked your life to steal, and because I suspect my own partner Marcus Hale may be part of the same game your father is playing. She stepped closer, still wary, but the knife stayed sheathed. She sat down across from me without being invited. For the first time since the night under my bed, we were simply 2 people at a table, the fire between us, the rest of the sleeping town far away. She told me more that night. Not everything, but enough. The tube contained proof of a secret pact her father would burn certain border towns to clear the roads for Cedric's smuggling caravans. In return, Cedric would supply weapons and information that would let Morvag crush rival orc clans. Ashvale had been only the beginning. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I pushed the ledger toward her. "Take what you need. I will make sure Marcus sees nothing unusual." She studied me across the lamplight. "You are risking a great deal, Elias Voss." "I know." She reached for the ledger, but her fingers brushed mine as she did. Neither of us pulled away immediately. The touch lasted only a heartbeat, but I felt it like a spark against dry tinder. Before she left, she paused at the window again. "Next time," she said softly, "you don't have to wait in the dark." The third time she came, the house was completely quiet. I had left the ledger open on the table and 2 glasses of wine beside it. When she entered, she did not go straight to the documents. She looked at the wine, then at me, where I sat by the fire. "You are making this very easy," she said. "I'm making it honest." She sat. We drank in silence for a while. The fire crackled. Outside, a light rain began to fall, tapping softly against the glass. "I am not only a lecturer," she said at last. "By night, I am what the soldiers call the shadow of the border. I steal what needs to be stolen. Documents, gold, secrets, everything my father uses to keep his power." I nodded. "And I am not only a merchant. I know every route, every bribe, every name on the payrolls that cross my warehouses." She set her glass down. "Then perhaps we should stop pretending we are enemies." I leaned forward. The firelight danced between us. "Work with me, Kyra. I can feed you real information from the merchant guilds. You can give me what you learn from the orc side. Together, we may be able to stop this before more towns burn." She was quiet for a long time. The rain grew heavier. "Why do you care?" she asked. "You lost 2 foundries. You could simply rebuild and forget." I looked at her, really looked. At the way the fire painted shadows under her golden eyes, at the small scar on her hand, at the way she held herself as though the entire world might turn on her at any moment. "Because the night you crawled out from under my bed, I said I stopped feeling like a man who only counted coins and signed contracts. For the first time in years, I felt something real." Her gaze did not waver. "You are a dangerous man to know, Elias Voss. Perhaps, but I am also a useful one." She reached across the table and took the ledger. This time, her fingers lingered against mine deliberately. The touch was warm, steady, and full of unspoken questions. "I will think about your offer," she said. She left through the window as always, but before she disappeared into the rain, she looked back once. The look she gave me stayed with me long after the sound of her footsteps faded. The next morning, Marcus Hale arrived at my door earlier than usual. His face was tight. I hear you have been receiving late-night visitors, he said without greeting. A scholar from the academy, a woman with green skin and golden eyes. People are talking Elias. Captain Harlan of Cedric's guard has already asked me questions about you. I poured him a cup of coffee and kept my voice calm. Let them talk. She is helping me with translations for the new northern contracts. Nothing more. Marcus studied me the way he studied faulty ledgers. Be careful. Some fires are not worth the warmth they give. He left without drinking the coffee. That same afternoon, I saw Lena Voss Kyra's closest colleague at the academy watching me from across the market square. She was a quiet human woman with sharp eyes and a scholar's robe. When our gazes met, she gave the smallest nod, then turned away. A warning, perhaps, or an acknowledgement. That night, for the first time, I left the window not only open, but with a single candle burning in the sill, a small, steady light against the dark. I sat by the fire and waited. When Kyra finally came, she did not go to the table. She crossed the room and stopped a pace away from my chair. Rain glistened on her cloak. Her golden eyes held mine. I accept your offer, she said quietly. We work together. No more games. I stood slowly. The space between us felt smaller than it ever had. Good, I answered. Neither of us moved. The fire crackled. Rain tapped the glass. For one long moment, the only thing in the room was the sound of our breathing and the knowledge that whatever we had started the night she hid under my bed was no longer something either of us could walk away from. Outside, the town slept under the rain. Inside, something new and dangerous had begun to burn. The decision came on the 7th night after the fire. We sat at the heavy oak table in my study, the leather tube open between us, and the forged ledgers spread like a map of treason. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. Kyra's golden eyes reflected the dying flames as she traced a finger along the final line of evidence, my own warehouse records that proved Cedric Vale had been paying Morvag Drath in iron and information for months. We cannot wait any longer, she said quietly. The council at Stonefire Ford meets in 14 days. If we reach them before my father and Cedric, we can present everything in front of the border lords and the orc chieftains. They cannot ignore proof this strong. I stared at the documents, then at her. The cut on her temple had healed to a faint pink line. Her scholar's robe was gone tonight. She wore the dark traveling leathers again, the ones that still carried the faint scent of smoke and pine. If we go, I said, there is no coming back quietly. Marcus already suspects me. Captain Harlan's men are watching the roads north. Once we leave Ashvale together, the rumors will become accusations. Kyra looked up. The firelight softened the sharp lines of her face, but the determination in her eyes remained hard as iron. I know, she whispered, but if we stay, they will burn more towns, and eventually they will come for you because you helped me. I reached across the table and closed the tube with a soft click. Then we leave at first light. We traveled light and careful. 2 horses, mine a sturdy black gelding, hers a stolen scout mount with a quiet step. We slipped out before dawn through the garden gate, cloaks drawn high, hoods low. The streets were still dark and wet with last night's rain. No one saw us leave the wealthy quarter. By the time the sun rose, we were already deep in the northern woods, the smoke of Ashvale a distant smudge behind us. The journey to Stonefire Ford would take 10 days if we pushed hard. We chose to go slow. The first 3 days were forest trails and narrow game paths. We spoke little during the daylight hours, saving our breath for the climb. At night, we made small camps in hidden clearings, never risking a large fire. I would gather wood while Kyra scouted the perimeter. She moved like she had been born to it, silent, watchful, every step deliberate. When she returned, she would sit across from me, knees drawn up, and accept the tin cup of hot broth I offered without comment. On the 4th night, the temperature dropped sharply. A cold wind cut through the pines and rattled the bare branches. We had only one good blanket between us. I spread it over the bedroll and nodded toward it. Take it, I said. I have my cloak. Kyra looked at the blanket, then at me. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she stood, picked up the blanket, and walked around the small fire to my side. She sat down close enough that our shoulders almost touched and draped half the blanket over me. We share, she said simply, or we both freeze. I did not argue. We sat like that for a long time, the fire crackling softly, the wind whispering through the trees. Her arm rested lightly against mine. The warmth of her body seeped through the leather and wool. I could feel the steady rise and fall of her breathing. Neither of us spoke of the closeness. It simply existed natural as the night itself. She told me about her childhood that night, how her father had trained her with a blade before she could read, how her mother had taught her the old tongue of the mountains in secret, how she had once stood against a raid on a human village and been beaten for it. Her voice stayed low and even, but I heard the old pain beneath the words. I told her about the years after my parents died, how I had built the ironworks from nothing, how the wealth had come, but the emptiness had stayed, how I had never allowed anyone close enough to see the man behind the merchant. When the fire burned down to embers, we lay back on the single bedroll, the shared blanket pulled tight. Her head rested near my shoulder. I felt the faint brush of her hair against my cheek. Neither of us slept immediately. We simply listened to the forest and to each other's breathing until exhaustion finally won. The fifth night brought rain. We made camp under the shelter of a rocky overhang. The rain fell in sheets, drumming on the stone above us. I built a small fire deep in the recess where the smoke could escape without giving us away. Kyra returned from scouting soaked to the skin. She peeled off her outer cloak and hung it near the flames. Water ran from her black braids and traced shining lines down the green skin of her neck. I handed her my spare shirt, dry warm from being kept inside my pack. She changed behind a boulder and came back wearing it. The hem fell to mid-thigh on her taller frame. She looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable, and yet still impossibly strong. We sat shoulder to shoulder again, watching the rain. "You did not have to come with me," she said after a long silence. "I know. Then why did you?" I turned my head and looked at her. The firelight caught the gold in her eyes and turned the small tusks at the corners of her mouth into soft shadows. "Because the night you hid under my bed," I answered, "I stopped being only Elias Voss the merchant. I became someone who wanted more than ledgers and coin. I wanted to know the woman who had the courage to steal from her own father and the kindness to thank a stranger for a cup of broth." She was quiet. Then very slowly she reached out and placed her hand over mine where it rested on my knee. Her fingers were still cool from the rain, but they curled around mine with surprising gentleness. "I have spent my life running from alliances," she whispered. "This is the first time I have run toward one." We stayed like that until the rain eased. When we finally lay down, her head found the space just below my shoulder. I draped my arm lightly across her waist. The touch was not bold. It was simply there, warm, steady, and full of everything we had not yet said. On the 8th night, we reached the foothills of the Stonefire range. The air smelled of pine and distant snow. We made camp beside a small stream that tumbled over smooth stones. The moon was bright enough to cast silver light across the water. I was checking the horses when I heard the soft crunch of boots behind me. I turned. A tall orc male stood at the edge of the clearing. Dark armor, a long scar across his left cheek, eyes the color of winter steel. He carried no weapon in his hands, but I saw the hilt of a sword at his hip. Kyra stepped forward instantly, placing herself between us. "Torvek," she said, voice tight. The orc inclined his head once. "Princess, I have been following you since the second night. You travel slow. I travel careful," she answered. Torvek's gaze moved to me. He studied me the way a wolf studies a new scent. "You are the merchant who hid her," he said. It was not a question. "I am." He nodded once as if that answered something important. Then he looked back at Kara. "Your father and Cedric Vale ride hard for the council. They will arrive 2 days before you if you keep this pace. I can buy you time, but only if you trust me." Kyra's hand brushed mine again, brief hidden from Torvek's sight. "Why help us?" she asked. Torvek's scarred face remained impassive. "Because your mother once saved my life when your father would have let me die, and because I am tired of watching children burn for the pride of old men." He gave us a small leather pouch containing dried meat and a rough map of hidden trails. Then he melted back into the trees as silently as he had come. We stood in the moonlight for a long time after he left. Kyra turned to me. The silver light painted her face in cool tones, but her eyes were warm. "We are no longer alone in this," she said. "No," I answered. "We never really were." That night we did not keep distance between our bedrolls. We lay side by side under the shared blanket, her head resting against my chest, my arm around her shoulders. I felt the steady beat of her heart against mine. Neither of us spoke of love or promises. The words were not needed yet. The closeness itself was the promise. The last 2 days of the journey were harder. Captain Harlan's scouts appeared twice, once on a ridge above us, once at a river ford. Each time we hid in the undergrowth and waited until they passed. Marcus Hale's name came up in the fragments of conversation we overheard. He had sent word north. He had chosen his side. On the final night before Stonefire Ford, we camped in a narrow ravine, sheltered by high cliffs. The air was colder here. Snow dusted the peaks above us. We built the fire small and sat close, sharing the last of the dried meat and the warmth of each other's bodies. Kyra rested her head on my shoulder. Her hand found mine beneath the blanket and held it tightly. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she whispered, "thank you for walking this road with me." I turned my face toward her hair and breathed in the familiar scent of pine and smoke and something that was only Kyra. "I am not walking it with you," I said. "I am walking it for us." She lifted her head. Our faces were inches apart. The firelight danced in her golden eyes. For one long, suspended moment, I thought she might close the distance. Instead, she rested her forehead against mine, eyes closed, breathing steady. We stayed like that until the fire burned to embers and the night grew deep and quiet around us. Stonefire forward waited beyond the next ridge, gray stone walls, ancient banners, and the gathered lords of two races who would decide whether the border burned or found peace. We were almost there, and for the first time since the night she had hidden under my bed, I was not afraid of what tomorrow would bring, because tomorrow, whatever it held, we would face it together. Stonefire Ford appeared at dawn like a scar cut into the mountainside. Gray stone walls rose from the rock itself, ancient banners of both human and orc houses hanging limp in the thin mountain air. The pass below was already crowded with delegations lords in fine cloaks, orc chieftains in heavy furs, and iron merchants and scribes and armed guards. The air smelled of pine smoke, wet stone, and tension so thick it felt like breathing iron filings. Kyra rode beside me, hood drawn low, her back straight despite the long days on the road. Torvek had joined us the night before, silent and watchful, his scarred face hidden beneath a travel cloak. We looked like any other minor delegation arriving late. No one stopped us at the outer gates. Inside the great hall, the air was colder. Torches burned in iron brackets along walls carved with treaties older than my grandfather. Long tables formed a wide circle. At the head sat the neutral arbiters, two elderly humans and one gray-haired orc matriarch. The rest of the seats were already filled. I recognized faces from trade summits and border councils. They recognized me too. Murmurs rippled through the hall when I stepped forward beside Kyra. General Morvag Drath sat on the orc side, massive in black armor, the white scar across his face gleaming in the torchlight. Cedric Vale lounged on the human side, wine cup in hand, smiling like a man who had already won. When his eyes found Kyra, they narrowed. When they found me, they widened in genuine surprise. Kyra lowered her hood. A hush fell over the hall. Morvag rose slowly. His voice rolled like distant thunder. "Daughter." "Father," she answered. Her tone was calm, but I felt the tremor in the hand that brushed mine beneath the table. Cedric laughed once, short and sharp. "This is unexpected. The merchant and the runaway princess. Come to beg for mercy." I stepped forward before anyone could stop me. My voice carried clearly across the stone hall. "We came to present evidence, not beg." I placed the leather tube on the central table. Kyra set down the copied ledgers and the forged contracts I had prepared. Torvek stepped up beside us and laid down the additional seals he had carried from the north. The arbiters leaned forward. The hall grew so quiet I could hear the torches hiss. Kyra spoke first. Her voice was steady, clear, the same tone she used in the academy lecture halls. She laid out every detail, the pact between her father and Cedric, the planned burnings to clear smuggling routes, the villages marked for destruction, the gold already paid. She spoke without rage, without tears. Only facts, cold, precise, and devastating. When she finished, Morvag's face had turned to stone. Cedric was still smiling, but the smile no longer reached his eyes. "Lies," he said smoothly. "The word of a trader and a merchant who lost 2 foundries. Convenient." I stepped forward again. "These are not lies," I said. "They are my own warehouse records, routes, payments, names. Everything passed through my hands before I knew what they meant. I lost those foundries because your plan required them to burn. And I am here to make sure no more burn." The arbiters called for witnesses. Torvek spoke. Then 2 minor chieftains who had broken with Morvag. Then Lena Voss, Kyra's colleague from the academy, stepped forward from the back of the hall. She had ridden hard to arrive before us carrying student testimonies and copied academy documents that proved Cedric's men had been pressuring scholars to stay silent. The hall began to fracture. Morvag rose. His hand went to the hilt of his greatsword. "This is theater. My daughter is a traitor who stole clan secrets. The merchant is her whore." The word hung in the air like a blade. I felt heat flood my face, but I kept my voice level. If protecting the woman who saved my town from further burning makes me her whore, then I accept the title gladly. Kyra's hand found mine openly now, fingers lacing tight. She did not look away from her father. "I stole nothing that did not already belong to the people you planned to sacrifice," she said. "I am done being your weapon." For a moment, the hall teetered on the edge of violence. Guards shifted, hands moved to swords. Then the orc matriarch at the head of the circle slammed her staff against the stone floor. The sound cracked like a whip. "Enough," she said. "The evidence is clear. General Morvag Drath and Lord Cedric Vale will be held until judgment. Their forces are to stand down immediately." Cedric tried to protest. 2 human guards seized him before he could finish the sentence. Morvag looked at Kyra one last time. Something ancient and bitter passed between them. Then he allowed himself to be taken without a fight. The hall erupted into shouts and arguments, but the decision had already been made. We stood in the center of the storm and did not move. Later, when the hall had emptied and the arbiters had retired to deliberate the final terms, Kyra and I walked out onto the high balcony overlooking the pass. Snow had begun to fall in soft, silent flakes. Torvek stood guard a respectful distance away. Lena had already left to carry word back to the academy. Kyra leaned against the stone railing looking north toward the mountains that had once been her home. I thought I would feel relief, she said quietly. Instead, I feel empty. I stepped behind her and wrapped my arms around her waist. She leaned back into me without hesitation. Her head rested against my shoulder. The snow caught in her black hair like tiny stars. "You are not empty," I whispered against her temple. "You are free." She turned in my arms. The golden eyes that had once looked at me with exhaustion and defiance now held something softer, deeper. She lifted her hand and traced the line of my jaw with her fingertips. "I have spent my life running from alliances," she said. "This is the first time I want to run toward one." I kissed her then. It was not fierce or desperate. It was slow, deliberate, the kind of kiss that had been building for weeks across late-night tables, shared blankets, and quiet confessions in the dark. Her lips were warm against mine. Her tusks brushed my skin in the gentlest way. When we parted, she rested her forehead against mine and breathed out a long, shaky sigh. We left Stonefire Ford 3 days later. The council stripped Morvag of command and Cedric of his titles. New treaties were signed. The border would be watched more carefully now. Ashvale would be rebuilt with help from both sides. None of that mattered as much as the simple fact that Kyra rode beside me on the long road south. We reached my mansion at dusk. The servants had kept the fires lit and the house clean. Smoke still lingered faintly in the air, but the worst of the damage had been cleared. I opened the heavy front door and stood aside so she could enter first. Kyra stepped over the threshold and stopped in the grand foyer. She looked up at the high ceiling, the polished oak staircase, the portraits of ancestors who would never have imagined an orc woman walking these halls as something other than a prisoner. She turned to me. A small, tired, beautiful smile curved her lips, the same smile she had given me the first night when she crawled out from under my bed. "I never thought I would call a human house home," she said softly. I closed the door behind us, shutting out the cold mountain wind. "You don't have to call it a human house anymore," I answered. "Call it ours." That night, we did not sleep in separate rooms. We lay together in the same four-poster bed where everything had begun. The fire burned low in the hearth. Snow tapped gently against the tall windows. Kyra's head rested on my chest, her green arm draped across me, her breathing slow and even. I ran my fingers through her black hair and felt the steady beat of her heart against mine. Outside the town of Ashvale slept under fresh snow. Inside the house that had once felt too large and too empty was finally full. I pressed a kiss to the top of her head and whispered against her hair the same question I had asked myself every night since the fire. "Does my bed still have room for you?" She smiled in the dark, the curve of her lips brushing my skin. "Always," she answered, "and I'm never leaving it again." We did not know what the coming seasons would bring. We did not know if old hatreds would fade or if new ones would rise. But we knew one thing with absolute certainty. The night the Orc General's daughter had hidden under my bed while my town burned, I had pulled her into the light instead of handing her over to the dark. And that single choice had become our entire life.